In the suffocating gloom of the royal palace of Madrid, a chamber was sealed not just by wood and iron, but by a stench. It was a smell of corruption so profound it seemed to have physical weight, a miasma of sickness and decay that clung to the damask curtains and seeped into the very mortar of the walls. Here, on a sweat-drenched, filth-stained bed, a king was unmade. It was September 29th, 1833, and Ferdinand VII of Spain was finally, agonizingly dying. This was not a noble passing. It was a grotesque spectacle, the final act in a life defined by its own wretchedness. His body, once buoyed by the arrogance of absolute power, was now a swollen, putrefying landscape of disease. Syphilis, the patient and merciless fruit of a lifetime of debauchery, was claiming its final victory. His face was a bloated mask, his limbs were racked with gout, and his skin was a canvas of weeping sores and livid blotches. He was an object of horror, a monument to his own sins, abandoned by all but those who stood to gain from his last rattling breath. As he lay there, a husk of a man drowning in his own fluids, one must ask, how does a monarch, born to the most Catholic and ancient throne in Europe, devolve into this? This was not merely the death of a man. It was the physical manifestation of a corrupt soul, the final, foul invoice for a life spent in service to nothing but cruelty, cowardice, and carnal appetite. The story of Ferdinand VII is not simply the biography of a bad king. It is a clinical examination of how personal depravity, when invested with absolute power, can become a national poison, a slow-acting venom that corrupts the body politic as surely as the spirochete was corrupting the king's own flesh and blood. To understand the monster, one must first understand the swamp in which it was spawned. Ferdinand was born in 1784 into a Spanish court that had long since abandoned moral rectitude for a kind of theatrical rot. His father, King Charles IV, was a well-meaning but weak and intellectually vacant man, more interested in hunting and clockmaking than in the arduous business of governance. The true power behind the throne was Ferdinand's mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma. Ambitious, domineering, and possessed of a ravenous appetite for power and pleasure, she held her husband in gentle contempt. Her energies were focused on her relationship with the Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. A handsome, ambitious guardsman of humble origins, Godoy had risen through the ranks with astonishing speed, a trajectory fueled entirely by the Queen's favor and, as all of Europe whispered, her bed. The royal court was thus a dysfunctional triangle of power, a passive king, a manipulative queen, and an all-powerful favorite. Into this atmosphere of intrigue, cynicism, and thinly veiled adultery, the young prince of Asturias, Ferdinand, was thrown. He did not learn statesmanship or duty. He learned conspiracy. He did not see an example of noble leadership. He saw his own father cuckolded and marginalized, and power wielded by a man he viewed as an upstart usurper. A deep and venomous hatred for Godoy, and by extension for his own mother, became the central, organizing principle of his young life. This was not the righteous anger of a son defending his father's honor. It was the jealous rage of a boy who saw his own inheritance of power being enjoyed by another. From his earliest years, a darkness was evident in Ferdinand's character, a streak of casual cruelty that alarmed his tutors. He was recorded as being sullen, vindictive, and possessing a chilling lack of empathy. While other children might play with toys, Ferdinand was known to find pleasure in tormenting animals, a classic and grim harbinger of a deeply disturbed psyche. He was intellectually lazy, resistant to his education, and showed interest only in the basest of pursuits. His worldview, shaped in the crucible of his parents' court, was one of profound cynicism. He believed everyone was motivated by greed and lust, that loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold, and that power was a zero-sum game to be won through deception and brute force. As he grew into a young man, these traits did not mellow. They hardened. He became the gravitational center for every disgruntled nobleman, every conservative cleric, and every political schemer who resented Godoy's influence. They began to cultivate an image of Ferdinand as the savior of Spain, El Pisa, the desired one. They projected onto this sullen, cruel, and ignorant prince all of their hopes for a return to traditional Spanish values, a purging of foreign French influences, and the overthrow of the despised Godoy. The Spanish people, largely unaware of his true nature and desperate for a symbol of national pride, eagerly embraced this fiction. They saw in Ferdinand a handsome prince who would restore dignity to the throne, a stark contrast to the shambolic reign of his father. They had no way of knowing that the alternative they so desired was not a cure, but a far more virulent disease. The first true test of Ferdinand's character, and the first clear demonstration of his capacity for monstrousness in a personal relationship, came with his marriage in 1802. His bride was his cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. It was a political match, but Maria Antonia was far from a passive pawn. She was intelligent, cultured, and possessed a keen political mind and a strong will, all qualities that Ferdinand found intolerable in a woman. He expected a docile, subservient vessel for his dynastic ambitions. Instead, he found an intellectual and moral superior. Maria Antonia was horrified by what she discovered in the Spanish court. She saw the corruption, the boorishness of her husband, and the suffocating influence of her mother-in-law, Queen Maria Luisa, whom she grew to despise. She became the heart of a political faction opposed to the Queen and Godoy, attempting to guide her husband and steer him towards a more enlightened path. For this, Ferdinand subjected her to a campaign of relentless psychological abuse. He isolated her, mocked her intelligence, and engaged in flagrant affairs to humiliate her. The court, loyal to the queen, shunned and slandered her. Maria Antonia's health, always delicate, began to fail under the immense strain. She suffered 2 miscarriages, denying Ferdinand the heir he craved. In 1806, after a short and brutal illness, she died. The official cause was tuberculosis, but whispers immediately filled the courts of Europe. Maria Antonia's own mother, the formidable Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, was convinced her daughter had been poisoned. Whether by arsenic or by the slow-acting poison of unceasing misery and abuse, Ferdinand had effectively destroyed his first wife. He had eliminated a person who saw him for what he was, and in doing so, removed one of the few potential moderating influences on his dark character. With Maria Antonia gone, Ferdinand was free to indulge his primary passion, conspiracy. In 1807, his festering hatred for Godoy boiled over into a direct plot. Gathering his circle of sycophantic nobles, he orchestrated the conspiracy of El Escorial, a clumsy attempt to force his father's abdication and seize the throne. The plot was discovered, and Ferdinand was arrested for treason against his own father. Here, the world saw for the first time the true measure of his courage. Faced with consequences, he collapsed entirely. He wrote a groveling letter of apology to his father, begging for forgiveness like a whimpering child. More despicably, he immediately betrayed every single one of his co-conspirators, naming them all to save his own skin. He threw his allies to the wolves without a moment's hesitation. While they faced exile and disgrace, Ferdinand was forgiven by his doting father. The affair proved 2 fundamental truths about the prince. His ambition was boundless, but it was matched only by his absolute cowardice. He would never fight a battle he could not have someone else fight for him, and he would never accept blame when a scapegoat could be found. This craven betrayal should have destroyed his reputation, but paradoxically, the Spanish public, manipulated by his supporters' propaganda, saw him as a victim, a noble prince persecuted by the wicked Godoy. His moment of triumph, when it came, was not earned through bravery or skill, but through mob violence that he secretly encouraged from the shadows. In March 1808, rumors spread that Godoy was planning to move the royal family to Andalusia, and from there to the American colonies, to escape the advancing armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had entered Spain under the guise of being an ally. A popular uprising, the tumult of Aranjuez, erupted. A furious crowd stormed Godoy's residence, sacking it and nearly lynching the hated minister. Terrified for his own life and that of his queen, Charles IV saw no way out. On March 19, 1808, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son. Ferdinand VII was King of Spain. He had achieved his life's ambition through intrigue, popular rage, and the humiliation of his own parents. He rode into Madrid to the rapturous cheers of a populace who believed their savior had finally arrived. His reign, however, would last for less than 2 months before he would lead the entire Spanish nation into its greatest catastrophe. The desired one was about to prove himself a fool. Across the Pyrenees, the master of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, watched these squalid family squabbles with predatory amusement. He had no respect for the Spanish Bourbons, whom he viewed as decadent and incompetent. He had his own plans for the Iberian Peninsula, and Ferdinand's chaotic accession provided the perfect pretext. Napoleon refused to recognize Ferdinand as king and, employing a cunning diplomatic trap, invited him to meet on French soil at Bayonne to mediate the dispute with his father. Ferdinand's advisors warned him it was a trap. The Spanish people literally blocked the path of his carriage, begging him not to go, sensing the danger. But Ferdinand, blinded by arrogance and a pathetic belief that he could outwit the man who had conquered Europe, went anyway. He walked willingly into the lion's den. At Bayonne, the charade was dropped. Ferdinand found himself a prisoner. Napoleon also brought Charles IV and Maria Louisa to the city, where he masterfully played the dysfunctional family against each other. He berated Ferdinand for his treasonous ambition and threatened him with execution. He cajoled the old king and queen, who publicly disowned their son, declaring his reign illegitimate. On May 6, 1808, under immense pressure, the pathetic saga reached its conclusion. Ferdinand VII abdicated the throne, returning it to his father, who had already secretly abdicated it to Napoleon. In a single, humiliating transaction, the Spanish crown was handed over to the French emperor, who promptly gave it to his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand's reward for this act of supreme national betrayal was a comfortable and luxurious imprisonment. He was sent to the magnificent Château de Valençay, the estate of Napoleon's wily foreign minister, Talleyrand. While Spain erupted in the flames of resistance against the French invaders, a brutal, heroic, 6-year struggle known as the Peninsular War, its desired king lived a life of pampered ease. This period reveals the absolute nadir of his character. As his people were being slaughtered in the streets of Madrid, as peasant guerrillas fought and died in the mountains in his name, Ferdinand was writing fawning, obsequious letters to his captor. He congratulated Napoleon on his military victories over Spanish forces. He repeatedly begged to be adopted by the French emperor, to be allowed to marry into the Bonaparte family. He organized lavish parties at Valençay to celebrate French triumphs. He was not a defiant prisoner of war. He was a sycophant, a collaborator of the highest order. He showed not a flicker of concern for the immense suffering his people were enduring on his behalf. The guerrilla fighters and the liberal politicians who formed a government in exile and Cadiz fought under the banner of Ferdinand VII. They created a heroic myth around their absent king, a symbol of national resistance. They could never have imagined that their hero was spending his days plotting how to become Napoleon's most loyal subject. This period of gilded captivity was punctuated by the development of the Spanish Constitution of 1812. While Ferdinand was enjoying the hospitality of his nation's enemy, the liberal Cortes of Cadiz, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution that Napoleon ironically championed, drafted one of the most progressive constitutions in European history. It established a constitutional monarchy, curtailed the power of the church and the aristocracy, abolished the Inquisition, and guaranteed individual liberties. It was a revolutionary document, born from the blood and sacrifice of the war, and it was all predicated on the belief that when Ferdinand returned, he would embrace this new, modern Spain that had been forged in the fire. They had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were fighting for. For 6 years, the war raged. Hundreds of thousands of Spaniards perished. The country was devastated, its economy shattered, its social fabric torn. Finally, in late 1813, a defeated Napoleon, facing war on all fronts, agreed to release his Spanish pawn. He signed the Treaty of Alenquer, recognizing Ferdinand as King of Spain. In March 1814, Ferdinand crossed the border back into his ruined kingdom. He returned not to a nation, but to a crossroads. Two paths lay before him. He could accept the Constitution of 1812 and reign as a modern, constitutional monarch, healing the wounds of war and guiding Spain into a new era. Or he could smash this new creation and drag his country back into the darkness of medieval absolutism. For Ferdinand, there was never any choice. The very idea of sharing power, of being bound by a piece of paper written by men he considered his inferiors, was anathema to him. He was met by a delegation of conservative nobles and generals who presented him with the Manifesto of the Persians, a document urging him to abolish the Constitution and restore the old order. It was the only encouragement he needed. On May 4, 1814, he issued a decree declaring the Constitution of 1812 and all the work of the Cortes of Cádiz null and void. It was his first, and perhaps most profound, act of betrayal against the very people who had sacrificed everything for him. The cheering crowds who had welcomed him home as El Deseado soon fell silent, replaced by the screams of his victims. What followed was the Sexenio Absolutista, the 6 absolutist years, a period of savage repression that shocked even the most conservative monarchies in Europe. Ferdinand unleashed a vicious persecution of anyone associated with the liberal cause. The heroes of the Peninsular War, the men who had drafted the Constitution, the intellectuals who had envisioned a new Spain, they were all declared traitors. They were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and executed. He reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, that dreaded symbol of religious intolerance and oppression. He closed universities, burned liberal books, and purged the army and the civil administration of anyone with even a whiff of progressive thought. The Spain that had bled for its king was now being bled by him. His government was not one of policy or progress, but of personal whim and paranoia. He eschewed experienced ministers in favor of a camarilla, an unofficial kitchen cabinet of cronies, flatterers, and low-born sycophants whose only qualification was their slavish devotion to the king's basest instincts. The court became a nest of corruption and vulgarity, presided over by a king whose interests were now fully narrowed to two things: the absolute exercise of power and the relentless pursuit of sensual gratification. His personal life descended further into depravity. Having been a widower for years, he now contracted 2 more marriages in quick succession, both for purely dynastic reasons. In 1816, he married his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal, who died in childbirth just 2 years later in a horrific scene where surgeons, in a desperate attempt to save the infant, performed a crude cesarean section on her while she may still have been alive. The child also died. In 1819, he married another niece, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. She was a devout, almost pathologically timid young woman, terrified of physical intimacy. Ferdinand, brutish and impatient, found her piety and fear contemptible. Their marriage was a miserable, childless union, and she too would die prematurely in 1829, worn down by the misery of her existence and the constant pressure to produce an heir for a man she feared and loathed. Throughout these years, Ferdinand's true passions were indulged elsewhere. He was a notorious libertine, prowling the streets of Madrid in disguise, frequenting brothels, and engaging in countless affairs. His language was foul, his manners coarse, and his court a reflection of his own vulgarity. It was during this period of reckless debauchery that the seeds of his own physical destruction, the syphilis spirochete, most likely found fertile ground. Ferdinand's brutal and incompetent rule could not last forever. By 1820, Spain was bankrupt, its American colonies were in open revolt, and the army was seething with discontent. In January of that year, a military uprising led by Colonel Rafael del Riego forced Ferdinand's hand. The rebellion spread, and the king, ever the coward when faced with genuine opposition, saw that his position was untenable. He capitulated. In March 1820, he agreed to restore the Constitution of 1812, famously declaring with theatrical insincerity, "Let us march frankly, and I the first, along the constitutional path." It was a brazen lie. The next 3 years, known as the Triennial Liberal, were a period of undeclared civil war between the Liberal government and a king who was, for all intents and purposes, their prisoner. Ferdinand did everything in his power to sabotage the new regime. He used his veto powers to block legislation. He fostered divisions within the liberal ranks. Most treacherously, he secretly corresponded with the conservative powers of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and especially France, begging them to invade his own country and restore him to absolute power. He was once again actively collaborating with a foreign power against his own government and people. His pleas were eventually answered. The monarchies of Europe, alarmed by the precedent of a successful liberal revolution, authorized France to intervene. In April 1823, a massive French army, cynically dubbed the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, crossed the Pyrenees. The Spanish Liberal Army, weakened by internal divisions and lack of resources, quickly collapsed. The liberal government fled from Madrid to Seville and then to Cadiz, dragging the duplicitous king with them. Finally, trapped and with the French army at the gates, they surrendered. Before releasing Ferdinand, they made him promise a general amnesty. He swore a solemn oath that there would be no reprisals. The moment he was safely in the French camp, he broke his word. The period that followed, the Decada Ominosa or ominous decade, made his first wave of repression look mild. Ferdinand unleashed a white terror of breathtaking cruelty. Riego, the hero of the 1820 revolt, was hanged and quartered. Thousands more were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The machinery of state was turned into an instrument of vengeance. Spain was plunged into a paranoid darkness, a suffocating atmosphere of fear where spies were everywhere and a careless word could lead to the gallows. Ferdinand was now supreme, his power absolute and unchallenged, and his body was beginning to rot. By the late 1820s, the king was a physical wreck. Years of gluttony and debauchery had taken their toll. He was obese, afflicted with crippling gout, and the latent syphilis was beginning its tertiary assault on his system. He was a man aging in dog years, a walking ruin. But one crucial task remained. He still had no heir. His third wife, Maria Josefa, had died, and his younger brother, the Infante Carlos, stood as his successor. Carlos was an ultra-reactionary absolutist, a man who made Ferdinand look like a moderate. The prospect of his brother inheriting the throne was, for Ferdinand, the ultimate personal and political failure. So, at the age of 45, the decaying king decided he must marry a fourth and final time. His choice was another niece, the 22-year-old Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. She was vibrant, charming, and, unlike his previous wives, politically astute and ambitious. She understood her mission perfectly, to provide an heir and to secure her own power. To everyone's astonishment, the young queen quickly became pregnant. The succession, it seemed, was secure. But fate had a final, cruel twist in store for Spain. The problem was a matter of law. Since the early 18th century, Spain had operated under a form of Salic law, introduced by the Bourbon dynasty, which barred females from inheriting the throne if there were legitimate male relatives in the line of succession. This meant that even if Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, the throne would still pass to Ferdinand's brother, Carlos. However, Ferdinand's father, Charles IV, had in 1789 secretly approved a pragmatic sanction to revert to the traditional Spanish law that allowed female succession, but he had never formally published it. Now, in March 1830, urged on by Maria Cristina, who was determined that her child would rule, Ferdinand formally published the pragmatic sanction. The effect was seismic. It instantly disinherited his brother Carlos and designated Ferdinand's unborn child as the heir to the throne, regardless of its sex. In October 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. The battle lines were drawn. The kingdom split into two irreconcilable factions: the Carlists, who supported the claim of Don Carlos and the iron fist of absolutist tradition, and the Isabelinos or Cristinos, who supported the infant queen and her mother, a faction that was forced, out of political necessity, to align itself with the very liberals Ferdinand had spent his life persecuting. The king's final years were a living hell, a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion played out against a backdrop of frantic political intrigue. His health collapsed entirely. The syphilis, now rampant, attacked his central nervous system. He suffered from horrifying skin diseases, his legs covered in suppurating ulcers. He was often delirious, his mind clouded by pain and medication. He was a grotesque parody of a king, a prisoner in his own decaying body, his immense power now reduced to the ability to groan or nod. The royal palace became a battlefield for his soul. In September 1832, believing the king to be on his deathbed, the Carlist ministers, led by the arch-conservative Francisco Calamard, surrounded him. They convinced the barely conscious Ferdinand that publishing the Pragmatic Sanction would cause a civil war and damn his soul. They pushed a pen into his trembling hand, and the dying king signed a decree revoking the sanction, restoring Carlos as his heir. It was the Carlists' ultimate victory, but they had underestimated Maria Cristina. Learning of the betrayal, she launched a furious counterattack. Aided by her sister, she confronted the ministers, rallied her liberal-leaning supporters, and, according to legend, stormed into the king's chambers. She presented Ferdinand, who had made a slight and unexpected recovery, with the decree he had signed. Seeing the evidence of his weakness, he was shamed into action. On December 31st, 1832, he signed another, final decree, not only reaffirming the Pragmatic Sanction, but also dismissing the Carlist ministers who had tricked him. He had secured the throne for his daughter, but in doing so, he had made civil war an absolute certainty. His last act of political will was complete. Now, all that was left was for his body to finish its long and gruesome process of self-destruction. The final 9 months of his life were an unrelieved horror. He was in constant, excruciating pain. His mind drifted in and out of lucidity. The stench of his sickness was so overpowering that few could bear to be in his presence. The court that had once revolved around his every whim now revolved around the reports from his physicians, waiting for the inevitable end. He was utterly powerless, a lump of suffering flesh kept alive by the desperate efforts of his doctors and the political needs of his wife's faction. He was alone with the ghosts of his life, the wives he had abused, the patriots he had betrayed, the people he had terrorized. Power had been his entire existence, and now it was gone, leaving only the pain. On the morning of September 29th, 1833, after a violent choking fit, the struggle finally ended. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, the desired one, died in agony, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter as queen, a kingdom fractured beyond repair, and a legacy of nothing but shame. The immediate aftermath of his death was exactly as he had been warned. The country exploded. The day after the king's funeral, his brother Carlos issued a proclamation declaring himself King Charles V, and the First Carlist War began. Ferdinand's final act of spite against his brother had plunged Spain into a devastating civil war that would last for 7 years, and its aftershocks would trigger 2 more such wars throughout the 19th century. He had left his infant daughter not a kingdom, but a battlefield. His legacy was one of pure, unmitigated destruction. He had inherited a global empire and left behind a third-rate European power on the brink of collapse. He had been given the loyalty of a people who had fought and died for him, and he had repaid them with torture and execution. He had twice been offered the chance to lead his country into a modern, constitutional era, and he had twice chosen the path of brutal, medieval tyranny. His reign stands as a monument to incompetence, cruelty, and the catastrophic consequences of placing absolute power in the hands of a man with no virtue, no honor, and no courage. History's judgment on Ferdinand VII is unambiguous and severe. He is remembered, not as El Desada, but as El Rey Felon, the felon king. There is no revisionist history that can salvage his reputation, no hidden context that can excuse his actions. He was a bad seed planted in poisoned soil, who grew into a toxic tree that blighted everything under its shadow. The contrast between the public image once crafted for him and the private reality of the man is perhaps the most profound in Spanish history. The desired prince was, in truth, a monster of selfishness. The symbol of national resistance was a cowardly collaborator. The father of his people was their most vicious persecutor. His story serves as a chilling cautionary tale. It demonstrates that the personal character of a ruler is not a private matter, but a public concern of the highest order. A man who is cruel in his family life will be cruel in his policies. A man who breaks his word to his friends will break his oath to his nation. Absolute power did not corrupt Ferdinand VII. It merely provided him with a grander stage upon which to perform his already profound corruption. In the end, we are left with that final, ghastly image. The king on his deathbed, his body a festering ruin. The syphilis that consumed him was more than just a disease. It was a perfect, horrifying metaphor. The external decay was merely the visible manifestation of the internal rot that had defined his entire existence. The slow, relentless corruption of his flesh mirrored the slow, relentless corruption he had inflicted upon the soul of Spain. He was a king whose body became a testament to his reign, a foul and putrid legacy written not in stone or statute, but in diseased and dying tissue. He left behind a broken country and a name that would forever be a synonym for the very worst that monarchy can produce.